What if I told you that your greatest terror isn't something that could ever physically harm you? What if it is something far worse, something that exists within the labyrinth of your own mind, hidden in the darkest recesses of your thoughts? The kind of fear that doesn't just pass when the lights are turned on or the noise fades away. No, this is the kind of fear that lingers, creeps, and twists, poisoning the very core of your consciousness. Fear has been a companion to humanity since the beginning of time, a primal instinct ingrained in our very DNA. But what happens when that fear goes beyond simple survival instincts? What happens when fear becomes an all-consuming force, bending the human mind, distorting reality, and leaving a permanent scar on the psyche? As we dive deeper into the chilling nature of fear, we must ask, what are the true effects fear has on the human mind? Is it merely a fleeting sensation, or does it have the power to reshape our thoughts, behaviors, and perceptions of reality itself? Tonight, we explore the horrors that arise when fear begins to control us from within. But be warned, this isn't a story with a comforting resolution. There is no neat ending, no easy answers. The terror you are about to discover may haunt you long after you've finished watching. In the shadows of history, there are dark tales, ancient legends, whispered warnings, and eerie encounters, telling of minds pushed to their breaking point by fear. Join me as we venture into these terrifying stories and unravel the sinister effects fear has on the human psyche, where the boundaries between nightmare and reality blur, and where your own mind may just become your greatest enemy. Fear has haunted the human race since the first heartbeat echoed through the night. It is an ancient force, as old as the earth itself, lying dormant in the subconscious, waiting for the right moment to rear its monstrous head. But what is fear, really? Where did it come from? And why does it hold such a terrifying sway over us? Ancient cultures believed that fear was not merely an emotion, but a spirit, a dark force that could possess the mind and soul. In Egypt, fear was personified by the goddess Sekhmet, a lioness-headed deity known for her violent wrath. It was said that her breath could scorch the earth, and that her fury would turn the very air to ash. But her most feared ability was the power to possess and warp the minds of mortals, leading them into madness and despair. It was said that even the bravest warriors would quail before her gaze, succumbing to irrational terror, their minds shattered by her influence. In the chilling pages of folklore, fear often comes not from what we can see or touch, but from what we cannot. Something lurking in the unseen shadows of the world, waiting to strike. One of the most enduring tales comes from the forests of Eastern Europe, where the fear of the strigoi, vampires that could invade the very soul, was so potent that entire villages would burn their dead, fearful that they would rise again, not in body, but in mind, as something warped and unnatural. It wasn't their physical form that terrified the villagers. It was the idea that death could not even protect the mind from corruption. And yet the most sinister and timeless lore centers around the idea that fear itself is a living, breathing entity, an ancient force that has always existed alongside us. There are whispers of a dark, forgotten god, known only as the Hollowbone, a being that feeds on fear and possesses the power to amplify it beyond imagination. According to these legends, this entity does not merely cause fear, but warps perception itself. A glance from the Hollow One can distort reality, twisting the mind, creating nightmares that bleed into the waking world. Once touched by this dark force, those affected would begin to see things, twisted visions that no sane person could explain, shadows that move when no one is around, whispers from empty rooms, faces in the corners of your eyes that disappear the moment you turn your head. It is said that even the most powerful kings and queens, when confronted with the influence of the Hollow One, would find themselves driven mad, their thoughts spinning in an endless cycle of terror, unable to distinguish illusion from reality. It's believed that this dark force is timeless, lurking in the depths of the human mind, feeding on our greatest fears, always waiting for the moment it can emerge from the shadows and claim another victim. In modern times, science has tried to explain fear as a mere response to danger, an automatic reaction hardwired into the brain. The fight-or-flight response, they call it, a physiological defense mechanism designed to protect us from harm. But what if the truth is far darker? What if fear isn't just a biological reaction, but a doorway, a conduit to something far more sinister? And what if the human mind, when overcome by fear, becomes a vessel, one that is not always in control? As we continue, remember that the most terrifying monsters are not always the ones with fangs or claws. Sometimes, the greatest horrors are the ones that lie just beneath the surface of our own thoughts. The power of fear is something that we may never fully understand, but it is always there, waiting, quietly, patiently, lurking in the shadows, ready to break free and consume us. It began on a night like any other, a night when the world outside seemed to hold its breath, as if anticipating something terrible, something unknown. William had always considered himself a rational man, steady, grounded, skeptical of anything that could not be explained by logic or science. He worked as a psychologist, dealing with patients suffering from anxiety, trauma, and nightmares. Yet he had never truly believed in the power of fear. It was just a chemical reaction, a flaw in the brain's wiring, nothing more. But that night, as he sat alone in his dimly lit office, a strange feeling settled over him. A cold, creeping sensation, like fingers of ice tracing down his spine. It was a feeling he couldn't place, and it made him uneasy. Something beyond the ordinary, something that seemed to press in on him from all sides. He tried to shake it off, but it only grew stronger, thicker, like the very air had become heavier. He stood up, pacing back and forth, trying to rid himself of the unsettling presence. The office was silent, save for the faint hum of the overhead lights and the ticking of the clock on the wall. But then, it started. At first, it was a soft whisper, so faint it could have been mistaken for the wind. But it wasn't the wind. It came from somewhere deeper, somewhere darker. His heart rate quickened, his breath growing shallow as the whispering grew louder, a cacophony of unintelligible words swirling in his mind. The sounds seemed to come from all directions, from within the walls, from under the floor. The shadows in the room lengthened, twisting like dark tendrils, as though something was reaching out from the depths of the unknown. William's rational mind screamed that he was imagining it, that it was just the stress of his job or the creeping fatigue that had settled in his bones. But the fear, it was real. It gnawed at him, a primal, instinctual terror, pulling at his very consciousness. He reached for his phone, but his hands trembled too violently to hold it steady. Then, in a flash of movement, something caught his eye. A fleeting figure, a shape that appeared in the corner of the room, standing just out of his direct line of sight. His breath caught in his throat. He turned quickly, but there was nothing there, only the empty space where it had been. His pulse raced as the darkness in the corners of the room seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive, and the whispering became clearer, almost intelligible, as if someone, or something, was speaking directly into his mind. A voice that was at once distant and near, its tone mocking, cruel, like it knew his deepest fears. The fear was no longer just in his head. It was real. It was there, surrounding him. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind swept through the room, slamming the door shut with a deafening bang. William stumbled backward, his heart pounding, his mind swirling in a frenzy of confusion and terror. The room, once familiar and safe, now seemed foreign, alien. The walls seemed to close in on him, the shadows creeping forward, hungry, consuming. In a panic, he rushed to the door, but it wouldn't open. It was as if something from the other side was holding it shut, trapping him within. His mind raced, searching for an explanation, anything that could make sense of this madness. But there was none, only fear, raw, unrelenting fear that twisted everything around him, making even the most mundane seem monstrous. And then he saw it, a figure emerging from the shadows, its form shifting and changing, like a nightmare brought to life. It was tall, its body a silhouette of inky blackness, its face obscured by shadows that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The air grew colder still, and the whispering intensified, now a chorus of voices that echoed in his mind. William could feel it now. This was no hallucination, no trick of the light. This was real, and it was coming for him. His breath came in ragged gasps as his eyes darted from corner to corner, searching for a way out. But there was no escape. The walls closed in, and the figure in the shadows stepped closer, its presence suffocating. The terror wasn't just in the room anymore, it was inside him. The figure in the shadows loomed closer, its form twisting in unnatural ways, as if it were made of liquid darkness, something too grotesque and alien for the human eye to fully comprehend. The whispering, now a maddening symphony, clawed at the edges of William's sanity, pulling him deeper into the abyss. He could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was a hallucination. Everything around him felt like a waking nightmare, a dreadful fever dream. His mind raced for answers, for logic, but logic had long since abandoned him. His body trembled uncontrollably, a cold sweat slicking his skin, his heart a frantic drumbeat in his chest. The room, once an anchor to reality, now felt like a prison, its walls warping and breathing, as though it too was alive, feeding on the terror that coursed through him. As the dark figure approached, its presence seemed to distort the very air, making it thick and oppressive, suffocating him. The temperature dropped sharply, and William's breath came out in visible clouds, the chill gnawing at his bones. His eyes, wide and frantic, flicked from the shadowy form to the door, still locked, still impenetrable. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to fight, to do anything to escape, but his body betrayed him. He could scarcely move, as if the fear itself had paralyzed him. It wasn't just a voice, it was a sensation, a presence, something that crawled into his mind and wrapped around his thoughts. The words felt like they were etched into his very soul, burning into him with an intensity that made him gasp. His body lurched forward as if yanked by invisible chains, and he stumbled, his knees buckling beneath him. The figure, now standing only inches away, seemed to radiate an otherworldly energy, an overwhelming pressure that seemed to crush his chest. "You know fear, don't you?" The voice spoke again, this time clearer, more forceful. "The fear you've never understood. The fear that has always been inside you." William's breath hitched. He wanted to scream, to fight, but his throat closed up as if the air itself had become thick with the weight of his terror. "Look into your mind. Look deep enough, and you will see." The figure extended a hand, its fingers elongated, skeletal, reaching toward his face. a sickeningly slow motion, like the dragging of time itself. Without thinking, William swatted it away, a desperate reflex, but his hand passed right through it, as if the figure was made of smoke. Panic surged through him, but there was no escape. The presence inside the room, inside him, was too powerful, too overwhelming. His mind, once rational and controlled, was now a swirling vortex of terror. Then the shadows in the corners of the room began to shift once more. They weren't just shadows. They were memories. His memories. But they weren't his own. They were twisted, distorted, like a funhouse mirror reflecting his past in grotesque, nightmarish forms. He saw himself as a child, alone, in a darkened hallway, his small heart pounding with the same fear he felt now. But this time, there was something else in the hall with him, a faceless figure, always just out of reach. It had watched him, waited for him, followed him through the years. Every time he had felt the chill of terror as a child, it had been there. Every time he had felt the dread of the unknown, it had been watching. The truth slammed into him like a physical blow. This thing, this entity, had always been with him. It had fed on his fear, nurtured him, and grown stronger with each terrified breath. And now it had come to claim him. The figure stepped closer still, and with each step, William's mind splintered further, his thoughts unraveling like loose threads in a storm, his perception of the world twisted. The walls of the room flickered, like static on an old television set, and the figure became 1,000 shifting forms, faces, hands, eyes, all watching him, waiting. The figure loomed over him, and for the first time, William could see its face, if it could even be called a face. It was a distortion, a mask of nothingness, a shifting blur of dark energy, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce into his very soul. And in those eyes, he saw something that made his heart stop, a reflection of himself, his own mind, broken and lost. Fear is not just something you experience. It is something you become. The words, once again, carved into his mind like knives, searing into his consciousness, filling every corner of his thoughts with darkness. Suddenly, the room fell into silence. But it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the kind of silence that comes just before the storm, heavy, expectant, suffocating. The walls closed in on him, the floor shifting beneath his feet, and in that moment, William realized the horror of his fate. Fear was not just a feeling, it was his prison, and now it had consumed him entirely. William's mind was slipping, fading like a distant echo. The figure before him, that thing, that terror, continued to loom over him, its presence suffocating, its form an endless cascade of shifting nightmares. Every word it spoke, every movement it made, drove a deeper wedge between him and the reality he once knew. He was no longer sure if he was standing in his office or trapped inside some twisted version of his own psyche. "You thought you could outrun me." The voice came again, no longer a whisper but a booming declaration, as though the room itself were speaking. The darkness surrounding William seemed to pulse, throbbing with life, with malevolent intent. His chest tightened, his breathing shallow, each inhalation like a desperate gasp for air in a world that had become devoid of oxygen. He fell to his knees, his mind a swirling mass of dread and confusion. The memories, the horrors that had been locked away in the deepest corners of his mind, were flooding back with unrelenting force. It was as if everything he had tried to forget, all the moments he had pushed to the back of his consciousness, were now coming to life. The child he had been, the terrified little boy who had always feared the dark, was still there, still trapped inside him. And now, That fear was no longer just a shadow in his past. It was alive, fully manifested, and it was here to claim him. But then, as his vision blurred and his thoughts began to slip away, something unexpected happened. A flicker, a faint spark of clarity amidst the chaos. The terror was so deep, so all-encompassing, that for a brief moment, William felt a flicker of defiance. He was a psychologist. He had spent his life studying the mind, understanding its fears, its weaknesses. But what if he could turn that knowledge on itself? What if he could understand the terror, face it, confront it head-on? Summoning every ounce of willpower, he forced himself to stand, his knees trembling, his mind screaming at him to give in. But he gritted his teeth, steadying himself. He closed his eyes, shutting out the nightmarish landscape around him, and focused inward. "I am not afraid of you," he said the words aloud, though they felt hollow, weak, against the oppressive force surrounding him. For a moment, the darkness paused. It recoiled as if taken aback by his defiance, but it quickly resumed its crawl, its pulse growing stronger, more insistent. The figure, now towering over him, spoke once more, its voice a haunting, guttural rasp. "You cannot fight me, William. I am you. I am everything you've ever feared, everything you've ever buried deep inside. Fear is the truth of your existence. Fear is what you are." The room trembled with the force of the words, and yet in the depth of his terror, something began to change. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A shift, a realization. William began to see the truth. Fear was not his enemy. Fear was his tool. Fear had always been with him, not as a dark force to be destroyed, but as a guide. It was his survival instinct, his primal force. He had run from it for so long, but in doing so, he had only fed it, made it stronger. What if he stopped running? What if he faced it, head-on? The shadows began to retreat as William's thoughts cleared. He opened his eyes, now meeting the blackness of the figure's hollow gaze with newfound strength. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he understood. "You are not me," he whispered, the words barely escaping his lips, but they carried with them an unexpected power. "You are just a part of me." The figure recoiled, its form shuddering, as if disturbed by the acknowledgement. It was no longer the monstrous thing that had been torturing him. It was just a shadow, a reflection of his deepest fear, nothing more. For the first time, in what felt like an eternity, the room began to settle. The oppressive darkness lifted, the walls no longer closing in on him. He could breathe again. But the silence that followed was not comforting. It was unnerving. William stood there, his heart pounding, waiting for the next step. Was this truly the end, or was it only a pause, a temporary reprieve? The figure vanished, as if swallowed by the darkness from which it came. The room, now still, felt eerily empty. William's mind, once shattered by terror, now hummed with an unsettling sense of awareness. He had confronted his fear, faced it, and survived. But in doing so, he had opened a door that could never be fully closed. As the minutes ticked by, the oppressive silence weighed on him. He could still feel it, the lingering presence of fear, a shadow in the corners of his thoughts, waiting for the next moment of weakness, the next crack in his psyche. For now, he was free. But freedom, he realized, was an illusion. Fear would always be with him, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to rise again. The room was quiet now, too quiet, as if the very air held its breath. William stood alone in the center, his heart still racing, his body exhausted from the ordeal. The fear that had once paralyzed him now felt distant, almost hollow, as if it had been replaced by something far more unsettling, an awareness that he could never escape the shadow of his own mind. As he took a step back, the soft hum of the lights above him seemed to amplify, their buzzing now more pronounced, invasive. The walls, once oppressive, now seemed to retreat into the distance, but the silence was deafening. It was as if the room had become a stage for a performance that had no conclusion, a script that had been written long ago and was still playing out in the confines of his mind. He reached for the door, his hand trembling as he touched the cold metal of the handle, but as he pulled it open, the world beyond seemed just as it had always been. The familiar, mundane reality of his office, of the city streets, of the world outside. The same world that had felt so real only hours before now seemed to belong to someone else. It was no longer his. He stepped outside, but the weight of his mind was still heavy, oppressive. He couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness, the fear, was still there, watching him, lurking just behind his every thought. The thing he had faced in that room had been more than just a manifestation of his terror. It had been a warning, a reminder that fear was not something to be fought and defeated. It was a part of him, an inseparable force that would always return, no matter how many times he confronted it. As he walked down the familiar street, the world around him seemed unchanged, but everything felt off. The sound of footsteps behind him, the rustling of leaves, the distant murmur of voices, it all seemed so distant, as though the very fabric of reality had been stretched thin. It was as if he were walking through a dream or a memory, something both familiar and alien. And then, as he passed a darkened alleyway, something caught his eye. A shadow, a fleeting movement in the corner of his vision. He stopped, his breath caught in his throat. A figure, dark and indistinct, stepped from the shadows, just like the one in the room. The same twisted form, the same hollow gaze, the same whispers that now rang in his mind. William froze, his pulse quickening, but the figure did not move. It stood there, still as death, watching him, waiting. His body tensed, his breath shallow. Was it real? Was it just his mind playing tricks on him, or was this the return of the terror he thought he had escaped? No, he had faced it. He had won. "You are not real," he whispered to the shadow, the words feeling as empty as the air around him. But deep inside, he knew. The fear, the darkness, it had never truly left him. It had only changed form. It was always watching, waiting for the right moment to return, to consume him once more. He turned away, his steps quickening, his heart pounding in his chest. As he walked into the night, the world around him grew darker, the shadows deeper, and the whispers of fear louder. It wasn't over. It would never be over. Fear was with him. Fear was within him. And it always would be.